So, welcome all of you, and you who are online, to a presentation on emergence coaching, and our title is Beyond Goals to Living with Vision. Now, my name is Dr. Gordon Medlock, and I work at the Wright Graduate University for the realization of human potential, and I'm a faculty member in the program in transformational coaching and leadership, and also a life coach. And I've been working on the model with my colleagues, Drs. Bob and Judith Wright, Dr. Mike Zwell, Kate Holmquist, and other of my colleagues and students for the past 30 years to develop the material that I'm going to be sharing with you today. So I look forward to the opportunity to do that with you. I'm also going to be sharing my experience of what it means to become, or my own process of becoming an emergence coach, my own journey of development, the challenges that it represented for me, and some of my experiences in working with clients today. I think this is the best way to convey what it's about, is to actually give you an experience of the process. At the same time, I'm going to be touching on 5 points, actually, that we'll be covering today. And I'm not going to be going through these in a linear fashion, but I will be underlining these through the course of my discussion. And at the end, I will underline them again so that you can make sure you hold on to those theoretical points we're making and practice points. So the first point that I'll be looking at is, what is emergence coaching, and what is this concept of emergence that we're talking about? So that's the first thing. Second thing are, what are some of the assumptions and principles that we operate from in emergence coaching to facilitate emergence? And those two things, as you'll see, come very closely together. The third point I'll be discussing is, what is it that distinguishes superior coaching from good or average coaching? Whether you're an emergence coach or not, what are the factors that lead to transformational impacts for students or clients? So we'll look looking at that question. Fourth question are, what are the competencies that belong and go with becoming an effective emergence coach? And fifth, what's the training process or the development process for you to be able to do these skills or demonstrate these skills and this way of being that we associate with emergence coaching? So we're going to be touching on all those points kind of woven together in the course of this discussion. Okay? Now, the other thing I want to say is, you don't have to be a professional coach to get value from this presentation. In fact, what I'm talking about will be of value to you in any interaction you have when you're involved in communicating with someone in support of them becoming their best selves. This could be a friend where you're dealing with a situation that she may be facing, and what are her challenges to really step up to a new level that she might want to in her life? Or a partner, or a spouse, or a child, or a colleague at work, or a boss, or even your mother. All of these people could be people that you're involved in these kind of conversations, and what I'm talking about today will be of value from you from any of those frames of reference. I also want to mention that if those of you who are interested in or are taking advantage of coaching for yourself, what I'm sharing today will be important in terms of how to get the most value from your coaching experience. So for all of you who are involved in that process, hopefully you'll be able to see it through that lens and get value for yourself. So that's a little bit by way of introduction. Now let's just dive in. We've got about perhaps 45 minutes together, so I want to make sure that we get it. We're going to be covering a lot, so I want to dive right in with you right now. First question is, what is emergence? What is this word that we throw around a lot? I've already mentioned it about a half a dozen times. You've got to be curious. So I'm going to introduce this idea by talking about the process of how it operates in the coaching relationship, okay? So when we're doing coaching, we make two assumptions about human beings. The first one is that we are all engaged in a process of becoming. Even though we think of ourselves as relatively fixed entities, like we all have a personality, we all have certain habitual ways of being, you know how Uncle Joe is or Aunt Mary, I mean, everybody's got their typical ways of being, but that's the way we think of ourselves often, but actually we are viewing people as a process of becoming. And you see that probably most vividly when you look at an infant baby or a very young child. You see them in this space of new discovery every moment. That's, we're intrigued. You can watch a baby just sort of engage with the world and what's going on there. They're in a process of becoming day by day. They're growing, learning, transforming themselves. So that process doesn't end when we get to be, grown-ups. It goes on and on and on, and we are looking at us as becoming human beings, becoming our best selves, becoming our most authentic selves. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, We also are creatures who love stasis. We love having things be comfortable and familiar. There's a concept in neuroscience called the window of tolerance between chaos and order. We like our little window of tolerance where things are comfortable, and we don't like to be jostled from that. So in spite of the fact that we have this propensity to become, we also want to keep things the way they are. So as an emergence coach, you're facing both of those dynamics in every interaction you have. And the process of emergence is the dialectical conflict and emergence that happens when you bring those two things together with an orientation to facilitate becoming. Now, I just threw a lot out there. So there's a lot that I just described. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about so that you can have a better picture of this. I'll use myself as the example. On the one hand, this stasis that we're talking about is what we call our matrix, this window of tolerance that we lived in. It's something that we developed from childhood that keeps us it's our way of negotiating our identity and our families and our way of dealing with the world. And all of our beliefs about who we are, what we expect from the world, and what the world expects from us. So for me, I grew up in a family where performance was very important. Doing things right, knowing what you're doing and being successful. In fact, it wasn't just important, it was like the thing. If I wasn't able to do that, my whole identity felt like it was shaking. For example, making mistakes was not okay. If I made a mistake, it was like, oh my gosh, I now am going to be embarrassed or even ashamed. In fact, I could make a mistake today, and who knows what might happen. So that fear of mistakes, and also was in my family system, what I internalized, and I wouldn't even say that my parents said these things, but this is what I got, was basically, it wasn't too cool to ask for help. If you had to ask for help, it kind of showed that you didn't have your act together and you're kind of weak. So basically the message was, be independent, figure it out yourself, alone and on your own. That's what it's about. And I got that down. Now, needless to say, that matrix has some limitations, right, in terms of how I operate. So I didn't really begin my personal growth work until actually as a young adult, and I became introduced to the human potential movement. And I read a book by Carl Rogers called On Becoming a Person. And for me, this became like my Bible of this is where I want to go. Carl Rogers laid it out. It's about connecting with my emotions, getting more deeply connected with myself, and being in relationship in a deeper way with others, and making that the foundation of who I am rather than this performance. So it was really about connecting with feelings in a deeper way, and also my yearnings to matter, to connect, and to make a difference in the world. So my becoming is about that. And my stasis is about performance and performance anxiety. I'm living in that process right now as I'm talking to you, in fact. So let me say a few things about how that emergence takes place. I'm going to talk a little bit about some assumptions that we use and operate to facilitate this dynamic interaction between becoming and our matrix that allows us to move forward in our life. When we do coaching with people, we make some assumptions, and one of the assumptions is that we're whole and complete as we are. That means that I have the resources within myself to solve whatever problem I may face, as do you. You don't need to have somebody tell you or help you or figure out that or do it for you. The job of the coach is simply to acknowledge and respect that capacity in the person to create their own life, to follow what they want and solve their own problems. So that's great, that we're all whole and complete. And the other piece that we focus on in terms of principles that we work with in facilitating emergence is this notion of intentional speaking. And what we notice, and this is an assumption, by the way, that comes from Alfred Adler, among others. I think I need a little water. My mouth gets dry. That all behavior is purposeful. Every interaction we have has intention. It can be conscious or unconscious. And the job that we're doing in training our coaches is how to have intention in your speaking in such a way that will move the needle in the direction of becoming, as opposed to keeping it in the area of the window of tolerance of our matrix. So learning how to speak with intention is very important. Now, we do a training called the Peer Personal Emergence Process. It's changed names various times, so PEP is the acronym we use. But it's about basically how to learn these two things. And so each prospective coach takes on two roles. One, the role of the speaker, speaking with intention, and the other person as the listener, doing what we call contextual listening. And what do we mean by contextual listening? It's the listening that holds the space that the person is sufficient and okay in themselves, okay? So in this training, if I'm the listener, all I do is beam at this person with acceptance and positive regard, like my audience here. So just holding that space for the person to do whatever they want to do. No agendas, there's nothing you have to do, there's no performance expectation, you just are you. And the speaker, if I'm the speaker, I speak into that space with whatever comes up. No agendas, whatever. And what's amazing is people change and grow out of that in a tremendous and dramatic way. That's a big eye-opener. And by the way, we spend a lot of time helping people do that without intruding and wanting to help, because everybody wants to intervene. Oh, what about this? Or come up with all these ideas. You keep all your brilliant ideas in your back pocket because you don't need them here. You're learning the power of presence and the power of holding space for another human being to emerge. It's a beautiful process. Please come in. Good to see you. Welcome. One of our WGU students has just arrived, it's Tanya, so thank you for coming. So, talking about emergence coaching, I'm talking about the PEP training, actually, and holding space. So you learn how to do these things. You learn how to hold contextual listening and intentional speaking to facilitate that process. And the power of it is that you learn that you don't have to force things, you don't have to try to make something happen. Your presence and being is sufficient. So for a person like me, the good news is you can't do it wrong. I can't mess up. I don't need to be in my performance mode. But the bad news is you can't do it wrong because it's not a performance. So I have to let go of it being a performance and learn a new way of being in order to do this work. Well, it's nice to have that in a training context where somebody tells you can't talk. You can't share any of your good ideas. You just need to hold presence. Okay, I'm obedient. I'm a good student, so I can do that. But when it gets into the coaching situation, sometimes that's a little harder than you might think. So you're with me as far as understanding what we mean by emergence and this process of this tension between my matrix and my becoming, and the idea of being able to speak with intention to move toward the becoming aspect of that, and the coach holding that context for the person, okay? So that gives you a little bit of the example of what this looks like in the concrete for me and how it works in our practice. Now, the other thing I want to mention is that Dr. Bob Wright has identified some of the key phases of emergence that's very important in looking at the trajectory of a session, which I'm going to be talking about shortly. He identified 5 phases that are important for emergence. The first part is engaging with the client. It's got to do with your being present with them in the way I'm describing and facilitating the sense of intention or direction of where they're going. Okay? Phase number 2 is discovery. You're going to be open to exploring because you're not coming in with an agenda. You're letting the client drive that agenda, and you're going to explore with them the different facets of whatever they're bringing into the room, what problems they're facing, what goals they want to accomplish, what issues they're dealing with. So there's this process of discovery and exploration. Now, at a certain point in this process, this interplay between my wanting comfort and my becoming, we arrive at an understanding of what is the focal point or the core concept that best describes the leverage point into becoming in this particular context. You know, for me, it would be that at what moment am I facing my anxiety about my performance and needing to connect with my feelings in order to really look at allowing that emotional Gordon to emerge as opposed to the anxiety-driven performance Gordon to emerge. That core concept is the focal point to understand that point in the session where that is emerging. Okay? And we call it a core concept. That comes from the grounded theory methodology of sociology, which I won't have time to get into a lot here, but it's a very important part of Bob's research. And it really is the idea that in any data field, there is the capacity to look at an emerging theory of what's going on in that data. And in this case, the data happens to be a human being emerging in front of you, and the core concept you're looking for is what's the focal point, the best metaphor, the best concept or way of describing who they are becoming in that moment. So that's phase 3 of the emergence process. Building on that, you develop a vision for help the person develop a vision for themselves in partnership with you of who it is they want to become. This is sort of like, if you think of this as we're moving toward from the funnel into that point in the hourglass where you're at the focal point of the core concept. And now we're going to go to visioning to help them see what's possible for them. So they're like, okay, now I could look at, gee, if I don't have to have performance anxiety, I could actually have fun up here. I could actually enjoy the process and really be playful about it. Wow, that's a vision of what presenting could be about. And I actually am noticing that as I'm doing that right now. So visioning is a very key part of the emergent process. And then once people have this vision and helping them articulate that, the 5th stage is what we call so whatting, which is actually, the so what of it all is, you need to turn this into action or nothing happens. You can have this wonderful moment, but if you don't have a strategy for how you're going to be different in the moment and when you leave the session afterwards into creating this in your life, it really kind of gets lost very easily. So the so what is, what's the set of actions and the strategies that I'm going to take to be able to build on that emergence, to build a new habit of a new me, okay? So 5 phases, and notice that it's just a natural flow. There's an arc to any interaction when you're working with someone, remembering that orienting to vision is the point where it opens, and you want to be able to do that, okay? So, you with me on the dynamics of emergence coaching? Okay, great. So those are the phases. Now, I think we need to talk about this in relationship to specific examples, and let me get that out here. I had tried to get this paper so I could easily pull it, and now I've got it. There we go, I got it. So I'm going to talk about a client that I've worked with. I'll call him Fred, okay? Now, it so happens Fred has the same matrix I do, highly into performance. And he measures himself by how much money he's made or how much money he has in the bank. And when he doesn't have money, he goes into huge anxiety, worst case scenario. So I meet with Fred, and when I'm talking with him, now you might think as an emergence coach, the question I would want to open with my coaching session would be, so Fred, who do you want to become today? But that doesn't quite work because Fred isn't used to that question. Most of us don't go through life thinking, how am I going to become someone else today, right? And that would kind of throw Fred off. It's too big a question. We need an on-ramp to that question because that's really the question I'm interested in. But we need an on-ramp. So the first thing I want to know is what's going on with Fred. What's Fred bringing in, you know? And Fred's bringing in his upsets about his financial situation and how he feels bad about himself and he can't get things done and things like that. Now, one of the things that happens, first of all, when I ask Fred a question, let me just take a step back. Typically, when I began my training in this process, what I would ask Fred is, so Fred, what outcome do you want to achieve today in your session? Now, because that was one of the key questions. People have to have an outcome so you can measure how effective you were. So the problem with this was, when I asked that question, Fred immediately goes into his matrix of performance. Oh, I've got to now come up with an outcome. I'm not even sure what outcome I want. And not only that, but I've got to please Gordon, my coach, who's the authority. So I've got to, what does Gordon want me to come up with? What's a good answer? So the anxiety just shoots up the roof. And basically, we've pretty much lost the potential for emergence happening in this moment because there's just too much anxiety. The window of tolerance has just locked in, and Fred's just going to figure out how to negotiate this thing for himself. But he's not going to be open to emergence. So I had to learn how not to get plugged into the performance mode of the way I even asked the question. Somebody else could say, what would you like to accomplish in this session today? And it would be perfectly fine if they weren't coming from my matrix. But if I'm coming from that place, my question itself and the way I ask it can have a negative effect and actually block the emergence of the other person. So this is really important in terms of a coach training process, which is we need to know ourselves well enough and our own matrix to know when we're getting in the way of our clients. In fact, a lot of the coach training is unlearning our habitual habits and being able to be open to not knowing and not performing and just being available and holding that space. For me personally, that was a big part of the challenge. So with Fred, I try to find more inviting ways to explore this question. You know, I say, so Fred, I want us to use this time together in a way that's going to be valuable for you. So what would you like to focus on that would be most helpful to you? Well, that's a little more inviting, right? There's not quite so much, it doesn't sound like performance. It's like, oh, Gordon's going to be with me around this. And so Fred gets a chance to start talking. Now, a lot of times what happens in sessions is they bring in whatever they bring in, and you don't know what it's going to look like. Now, one of my mentors, Francine Campone, grew up in New Jersey, and she lived in these flats kind of old buildings where they had these old pipes. And when you turned the water on in the morning, the water came out brown. The water that had been sitting in the pipes came out for a while, and it ran for a while until it would get clear. She says, so sometimes in the beginning of a session, you just got to let the brown water run. So Fred will go on and on about his stories of his financial situation, what's going on here, what are his accounts receivable, his accounts payable, what are the opportunities, lots of stuff that Fred needs to tell these stories about. Totally okay. I'm looking for what's going to be the focal point, right? I'm looking for where we're going to go with this thing. But I start with where Fred is, and at a certain point, there's certain questions that I can ask to help focus this. For one thing could be, I could interrupt Fred if Fred's going on a long time on his story and say, so Fred, of all these things, what's the most important thing you want me to get about what you're saying? That gives Fred a way to start focusing on, well, what's his intention in talking to me right now? His intention isn't just to share his story. His intention is to be here for some other purpose. What's important? And what we looked at, and what comes out of that question a lot of times, and it does with Fred, is the sense that the problem he's facing is that he tends to go to the worst case scenario when things are bad. And he looks at the disaster that's going to happen and how he's not going to be able to pay his bills and the upset he's going to have. And he misses the fact that he's very resourceful and has been able to go through this cycle many times and been very successful and has a robust pipeline in his sales pipeline and all of that. There are lots of things he could look at to say he's got the resources, but he's focusing on this negative piece. And that's where his pain point is the way he tends to do that. So as we're talking about that gets to be clear. In the discovery phase of this process, I start hearing he constantly goes back to that point of the disaster he's facing. So I will share at a certain point the observation that I'm noticing that, and I'm wondering, is there another way he could look at the situation besides this negative one? And he starts thinking about, well, yeah, I've done these things, and I've been here before. God knows I've been here all my life, and he knows how to work this stuff. So it turns out he does have this sense of capacity. And so as I'm working with him on that, it sounds like an outcome from this session would be if you could really orient to this more positive view of yourself as resourceful and resilient. That might be a nice outcome for this, a lot better than where you are right now. What do you think about that? He says, yeah, that would be great. So I've now gone through the dirty water to the clarity, swimming along with Fred, and we get to an outcome, a vision of what he wants in the session. And guess what? That vision is also a vision of what he wants in his life. So just taking him through that journey of getting clear about what he wants in his interaction with me, he's already started visioning his life. And over time, in my work with Fred, he eventually gets better at intentional speaking. He learns to orient to the positive. He gets the message after a period of time. So when I say, well, so what would you like to get out of the session today? He doesn't hate me and look at me like, why are you asking me that horrible question again? He says, oh, yeah, I thought you'd ask that. And we have a conversation, and sometimes he'll still share his story, but we get to where we need to get to. And then the cool thing in this particular case, a very recent session with him, in fact, it was the last session I had, we looked at, as he's looking at this vision for himself in terms of his resilience, the idea of an assignment or a task that he could do came to mind for me as I was engaging with him. And I said, and this kind of just came out of my own sort of sense of what would be right in my experience. And I propose it not like, this is what you should do, Fred, but more, here's something I'm thinking about. What do you think about this? How about every time, hello, welcome. Sure. Just make yourself come.
Now I get to see you.
Okay, fine. Okay, great, thank you. So, I said to him, so each time you notice yourself going to this negative state, can you catch yourself when you go to this worst case scenario place? He says, oh yeah, I know when I'm there. I said, so each time you do that, how about if you log, or you come up with a positive that you'd like to orient to instead of getting stuck in that negative, and write that down. So you have a sense of the moments when you've caught yourself and moved to the positives. Negative self-talk to positive self-talk. What do you think about that? He says, I think that'd be great. And so he starts thinking about that, and we talk about it a little bit more in the session. And in a couple of minutes, he's back talking about the worst-case scenario. So I say, well, Fred, here we are, right in the point we were talking about. So could you come up with a positive reframe of that right now? And he does. And so we start doing that a couple times in the session. So in the session, he's now working this process of becoming this new Fred, the Fred who sees himself as resilient. Hello, welcome. Thank you for coming. So you get the idea that the process is there, all of it in just getting this session moving forward. He's visioning, we start looking at an assignment he can do. It's not like these happen in sort of a linear order that at the end you're going to do the assignment. It actually is part of the whole process together. And what I'm really helping him do is move into that space, get a vision for himself, and begin building a practice, okay? So that's Fred. And Fred's been a great teacher for me because, as I said, he's a mirror for me. But I want to say one other thing about this problem of focusing on goals and tasks rather than being open to vision. Okay, remember the subtitle of this talk is Beyond Goals to Living with Vision. When I should make sure I'm looking at time too, so I know what we're at here. That's actually, okay, we're doing okay. So the thing about this is neuroscience research has shown that the most effective way to motivate people in growth in their coaching is to orient to the vision of who they want to become and the sense of purpose that would guide their life. In other words, it's really an important piece to facilitate their own motivation to grow and change. And the issue is that there are really two modes that we can frame questions and problems that we're facing in life. One of them is called task mode. That's where I'm really drilling down, highly cognitive, what's the problem I need to solve. Task mode is very useful, for example, when your car breaks down and you need to get it fixed. You're probably not going to be looking at your vision of who you want to become. You're trying to figure out, how do I fix this thing? So you're going to be putting your brains into that task mode. Very useful. We as a species absolutely need that for survival, and it's been great. We're really good at task mode, actually. The other mode is called the default mode network. And the default mode is the mode of the parasympathetic nervous system where we're more relaxed, deep breathing, kind of settling in. Take a deep breath. You might just find it kind of shifting from, I'm a little bit in task mode, so just kind of just noticing and relaxing into that default mode. And you can feel a kind of openness that happens. You're more open to what might come up. You're more in touch with your body. I'm more in touch with my body as I do this. So the default mode network is the place where visioning can happen. Now, the epitome or the extreme, why is it called default mode network? I was always curious. Actually, default mode is where your body goes when it's in dream state, sleeping. When we're sleeping, we're playing with all sorts of ideas and images. We're solving problems. We're playing with whatever the day's residue was. We're doing all kinds of stuff without any attention to task. It's just the nature of our brains to be open and creative. So it's not like default mode keeps you from solving things, but you're not doing it from a task mode mentality. You're doing it from this open space. So the research indicates that you need to connect default mode, you activate default mode to really have this visioning process and emergence process working well. So with our example with Fred, by helping him sort of get into this more open space, you could see him be able to consider possibilities that he wasn't considering before. So default mode, task mode, and the other thing about them that's important to know is you can't do both at the same time. If you're in task mode, it suppresses this dreamy, visioning wonderment place. And if you're in this dreamy wonderment place, it suppresses task mode. So good coaches, superior coaching, one of the things, are able to move between these two modalities at the appropriate time and the appropriate place to facilitate the openness and visioning when it's needed and being able to move to task when it needs to happen. So there's some versatility in all of that's really important. So the other thing I want to mention about this is one of the first really groundbreaking scholars in the subject of default mode network didn't know he was an emergence coach and didn't use these terms. It was Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud had this method where he had people lie down on a couch and free associate about their feelings about whatever, and it always kind of came down to their mother, as nearly as I can tell. But the truth was, it was open to whatever could come to your mind. And the brilliance of Freud's method was that it activated this default mode network. So the person's, in fact, his first book, the book that opened the whole pioneering of psychoanalysis, was his interpretation of dreams. He discovered this and the nature of the unconscious in his analysis of dreams, and then he created a method to help bring that dream state of the unconscious into consciousness. Brilliant, brilliant work. And one of the crimes, in my view, in the training of coaches, and for that matter, therapists and other people in helping professions, is they tend to dismiss the history like it's not important. So we don't talk about Freud anymore. Well, the fact is, Freud was his method of working was absolutely in consonance with the contemporary neuroscience research about how you facilitate visioning in people. He was way ahead of his time. In fact, he was a neuroscientist himself. So he was already doing that. And one of the things that I believe when I mention what is it that distinguishes superior coaching is people who have a breadth of understanding of the best of human emergence technologies across a wide range of fields. So it's people that understand Freud, but not just conceptually. And this is really important in our training work at the Wright Graduate University. We don't want just conceptual understanding of Freud, well, id, ego, superego, and different, that kind of thing. That doesn't help you be a better coach. But having the experience of the methods that Freud is talking about and what it means to be an emergent process and discover unconscious things that you haven't been aware of and know how to operationalize that in your coaching work and in your life, that's what distinguishes really good coaches. So at Wright, we actually are integrating 6 different disciplines, actually a few more beyond that, but I'll hit a few of them right now, that are really fundamental to understanding emergence coaching. Psychoanalysis and developmental psychology is one, for sure. Another one is Adler. Alfred Adler was a pioneer in understanding this piece of the puzzle related to the matrix, our limited beliefs, all those limiting beliefs that keep us from being able to grow and change, and how to confront those and challenge those. Pure Adler, brilliance in understanding the way we construct meaning in our lives. Very important part of our curriculum. Existential thought is very important. In fact, existential thought focuses on this process of human emergence as the nature of human existence. We exist as temporal beings. We exist oriented to the future, actualizing the future possibilities that we then integrate into what our past was, into our past and our story, based on our being present to that in the moment. So we're living time. We are a temporalizing process. We are an emergent process. Brilliant insight that they had. And interestingly, I did a lot of my major doctoral work, my dissertation work on Sartre. Jean-Paul Sartre was an existential philosopher. And he described the human condition, or the human being, if you will, as this polarity between what he called facticity and transcendence. Well, very familiar, right? Facticity is our stasis of our matrix, and transcendence is our capacity to become and transcend beyond that. So this polarity between facticity and transcendence was essential to Sartre's understanding of what it meant to be a human being. Now, I was just talking to one of my colleagues yesterday, who is in the audience, I'm happy to say, and I realized that Sartre never really put together the synthesis that would be emergence. He saw those as 2 distinct polarities, and what he did was he found that people either fall in love with their transcendence and see themselves as capable of doing anything but deny their facticity. That's one form of bad faith. Or they just say, I am, this is who I am, and they deny their freedom, which is what most people do. They don't want to explore the possibilities that would be too threatening, because they arouse too much anxiety, the dizziness of freedom, as I was reminded of today. So Sartre realized that we can move to either one of those forms of self-denial, and it's a form of bad faith, and he saw it as the human condition. Well, he was right in a lot of ways. We're all basically in bad faith because we all are basically denying often the potential that we have or some aspect of who we are. But what he missed was this process of emergence that can come from the dialectical interaction of those 2. He did have a conceptual way of treating it, but that's not really relevant here. The point was he didn't really see the possibility of authenticity as this emergent integration of these 2 polarities. So these are the kind of things that we don't just study and learn about. We learn the experience of it, and we go into that and experience it ourselves in the WGU program. We also write about our experience. And so it's really about understanding and integrating all this material. The human potential movement, as I mentioned, is very important. The notion of actualizing our potential is really what emergence is about through that frame. So, and I could go on and on about neuroscience that we study, the issues of, as I mentioned, the window of tolerance is a neuroscience concept, as are the default mode in task mode network research, and a bunch of other things about social and emotional regulation and intersubjectivity, all of which are too much for us to cover here. But my point is, good coaching draws on all of this in an integrative way. And it's not just, oh, I'm going to grab this and I'm going to grab this. It needs to come together as an integrated way of being that we focus on in Wright. And frankly, I don't know anybody else who's quite doing it at the level that we're doing it. And it's very challenging, but also very exhilarating as you have moments where you get to experience yourself doing things you didn't imagine, like playing at a presentation and having a good time. So this is all to say that this is another very important part of the process, is to be able to, superior coaching, to be able to have this breadth of understanding. Now, what I'm going to do now is kind of jump, because we're running out of time a bit here. I'm going to jump into another client to say a little bit about the discovery process. And I want to just hit this quickly here. This is Suzanne. I'll use, obviously, to keep confidentiality. And she was exploring a question about grieving related to her partner who had a serious case of cancer. And she was feeling a lot about that and really upset about what was going on, obviously, and not knowing how to share that. And she didn't want to get into the emotions. She wanted to stay above them, keep herself busy with other things. And as we explored that, the memory came up for her of an aunt that she had, who in her past memories, she recalled this aunt, had lost a child. And the aunt was grieving that child and that child's death her entire life. She never got out of the loop of the grief of that loss, which of course, as any parent who's lost a child knows, that is certainly a possibility. But my client didn't want to be like her aunt. She didn't want to be operating from that belief that this is going to define me. If I go into my grieving, I don't want to become someone who grieves about the loss of my partner when they die for the rest of my life. So as she's sharing that experience, this brings up a lot of feeling for me, actually. As she's sharing that experience, I'm, as the coach, remembering the grieving that I've gone through with the loss of my sister and my father and my mother over the past 5 years. And I've done a lot of personal work on that. I've looked at the fact that in my grieving, I'm actually tapping love for them that I had experienced that was more than I had experienced when they were alive. That actually my grieving has been an affirmation of my love for them and some of my regret at not having shared more of that at the time they were alive. So based on that, I'm in the experience with my client, and she's sharing her resistance, but she's having a lot of feelings, and I'm noticing this. And I suggest to her, could we look at this differently? Could we look at grieving as an affirmation of love rather than being fixed in an identity that you can't escape from? And as you can see, it brings up a lot of feelings for me, and it did for her too. She, at that point, really connected to how much she did feel for her partner and wanted to express. And this is one of those moments when the funnel gets to that core piece where she can start envisioning herself as a woman who can embrace her feelings and not have to ride over them and really live into that possibility. And it was beautiful. This is the magic of this work, which is so awesome. And, you know, when this happens, it's like, this is the cool thing about emergence coaching, is you have these moments that are just magical, you know. You see a person transform, and it transforms you as the coach as well. It's a little secret we don't tell. We get as much value from this as the client. I mean, as you can see, it's just an amazing piece. So long story short, she started looking at how she can start expressing herself more, and we looked at some things she can do with her partner to do that more effectively. So you get a picture of the trajectory of emergence and the process, and the principles that I want to emphasize and the skills here. The notion of mutuality, I don't think I've said that enough in this piece. We're not experts helping to fix people or take them somewhere. How am I doing for time? 5 minutes? We're really on a co-voyage journey with them. And so that's an important skill principle of emergence coaching that separates that from other kinds of expert models where the expert is helping the person guide them toward what they need to go to based on their knowledge. So there's a process of mutuality. There's also a sense that understanding that emergence isn't just something that happens in your client or in you. It happens in the interaction between the two of you. You create a field of emergence that happens that is unpredictable, and it's the adventure of the process. The truth is, this happens in all of our interactions all the time. We're always in a process of an emergent, in any communication, we're in an unpredictable situation where something can emerge. So this just doesn't need to happen in emergence coaching, but it happens in a very dramatic way there. So this notion of the co-voyaging, the tapping our own experience, that what's emerging for your client and what's emerging for you are happening. And a lot of times the wisdom of the coach comes from just tapping into their own experience. It was only through my having had the experiences of grieving my loved ones, and also having done some work on that so I could be clear enough that I could then relate it back to the client, is what allowed me to come up with that particular question at that time. And that's important to know too, because if the coach isn't doing their own work, I could have been hijacked by that. If I had all these unresolved feelings about the loss of my sister, and she's bringing up grieving, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I don't blame you for not wanting to get into the emotions. They're so overwhelming. I could actually stifle her emergence by my own unfinished business. So a really key piece of coach training is to be able to tap into that. So you're getting the picture, you're getting the understanding. I only have a couple minutes, and I did promise you that I would summarize our main points, and I'm going to do that right now. So what did we start out with? What's the nature of emergence, right? So we see this dialectic of interaction, of stasis and becoming, and the focal point in which vision can happen. That is the emergent process. What are the assumptions and principles? Holding people as whole and complete, and facilitating intentional speaking in a conscious way oriented toward becoming. What distinguishes superior coaching? First of all, a lot of it is doing your own work, that you're on a journey with your client. It's not that you're just here to sort of get them somewhere. You're doing that work yourself. And I could say more about that, but that's all I'll say for right now. The competencies you've heard some about today in terms of presence. Empowering questions is very important. You notice that many times I would bring up a question that would help the person see things in a new way. And active listening connected to that, really being present with the client at the same time. And the competencies I just mentioned. And then how do you learn this stuff? I think you've gotten the idea. You learn it by actually doing your own work, identifying where your matrix is, where your window of tolerance is, and be willing to stretch, look at your unfinished business, and make yourself available to support clients in their work. So I hope you find this helpful, and I appreciate you listening, and thank you for your attendance. Okay, thank you. Any questions or anything you guys want? We're done, right? Yeah. Any questions anybody wants to bring up or thoughts? Yeah.
So what do you do with your emotions if they feel really strong during the session?
Well, you kind of saw that. I had some strong feelings coming up as I was talking about that. There's a process of containment, because you don't want to overwhelm the client with your own emotions. So part of that discipline is learning to be present to yourself, but still remembering that you're here for others. So I had to, I had to kind of contain mine to recognize I'm still here to teach in this case, but it's an emergent process. So it's it's really something that you learn over time.
Kind of like telling yourself, okay, that's like now, later.
Yeah, exactly. Or sometimes you might realize, oh shoot, this is something I'm going to bring into supervision, because this is a big piece of unfinished business for me. So, yeah, okay, good question. Yeah, and we actually, in our supervision, we meet as a group with Bob, and we talk about, mostly what we talk about is our barriers to being with the clients. Our own, what we call counter-transference, that keeps us from really being able to help them evolve. So it's mostly getting out of the way of what's wanting to emerge. Yes. Exactly. And Bob is very good at pointing out our unfinished business. Any other questions? Okay. Well, I'll hang around a bit if you want to talk some more, but thank you guys. Okay.